We're going to be looking at anti-Black racism in the arts. And we call it, and the beat goes on, one desired outcome, multiple ways of addressing anti-Black racism in the arts. I'm going to share my screen for a second just to give some context to this conversation, which for many of us we feel is ongoing. And in some cases, preceding us for 400 years, and we don't know where we'll end. So part of it was great for us with CPAMO to join forces with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit in the city of Toronto, which we did back in, I guess it was 2019, when their staff came to an event we were having on Black arts mentorship up at the Nia Center for the Arts. It's not the first time we had addressed anti-Black racism issues in the arts, but it certainly was a moment when we brought artists together who were providing mentorships to other younger Black artists, but weren't aware of what each other were doing. And became aware, even though they were familiar with each other as artists, as activists in the field, they didn't know that, Coco Murray was doing this practice, that Lika at Nia was doing these practices, that Randolph was doing this with the Rise and so on. So we said, oh, wow, that's interesting. So we saw the importance of bringing people together. That was also important because of our own differences as persons of African descent, our own diasporas. How do we come to terms and understand the diversity within our own communities? I wanted to share very quickly the document, if I can find it, on anti-Black racism in the arts, which we had released in December at the Mayor's Roundtable. And I'm not going to go through it entirely. I'm just going to show you the table of contents and the importance of the document as we go forward. So in essence, we were looking at this issue from all disciplines. And what we wanted to really begin with was, what is the Black presence in Canadian arts? Kevin and I get into conversations around Blacknesses. There are Black folks who come from North America, who've been here for over 400 years as a result of slavery. Then there are folks who come through the Caribbean. And then there are folks who come from various countries in continental Africa. Then there are folks who come from the United Kingdom because of the impact of colonization and so on. So we're not the same. The question is, what is the city of Toronto doing to support arts, Black arts and culture? So we listed some of those things down here. We also talked with Black artists and administrators within community and talked about things like arts mentorships, like challenges, opportunities, and things that we feel can be done. And then we brought that all together in a report to the city, which basically said, here are the kinds of things we think are needed, that the city declare 2022 to 2032 as the decade for Black arts and culture. We've given some steps on how that can be done. That the city provides space to Black artists and arts organizations and core funding to develop multidisciplinary spaces run by and for Black artists and arts organizations. That there be core funding to support a Black-led policy research and advocacy, and that there be the engagement in support of external opportunities and accountability of how the city and the community are progressing around these kinds of things. With that, in our sort of, so to speak, having done that, that was released on December 11th to a roundtable that was convened by the mayor, who was very supportive when we presented the document. And part of the evidence of that support is we have two senior bureaucrats within the city's Economic Development and Culture Division who are here with us today. So how are we going to do this? We have 5 speakers. Andre Espinet. Ian has been doing a lot of work in music. And you know how important music is to us folks, right? I don't have to say more on that. And if I have to, wow, you're missing all the music that North America has predominantly created in the last couple hundred years, which comes out of Black bodies. Second, Marguerite Pigott. Marguerite, the director in film and entertainment. And so in her area, the city of Toronto, she looks after not just the film issues that we are dealing with in Toronto, and that could be people who want to shoot films in Toronto, people who need support, et cetera. And I was very honored to be facilitate a workshop, a networking session that that division called to bring together Black filmmakers so they can become more familiar with each other, become to understand what each other are doing, and then basically see how they might be able to work together or approach the city in unison. Khalidah Bello, who is working on what's our presence in the public domain? Things like statues. This is an interesting time for statues because we're seeing so many statues being taken down for various reasons, right? Because people like Cecil Rhodes. You know what was Rhodes? Rhodesia, where he basically tore down the ziggurats in Zimbabwe because he wanted to be clear that there was no evidence of civilization. No evidence of civilization. So now his statues are being torn down. Yet, what are statues that reflect Black heroism, Black achievement, Black recognition across our diasporas? So that's something that Khalidah is working on. Cheryl Blackwood, at the City of Toronto, heading up museums and historical sites. And how do we intervene in these sites that are, as we just saw in that wonderful video, William Lyon Mackenzie, while an abolitionist, separate from the history of Marianne Shad Carey, even though they're fairly simultaneous. Why do we know more about him than her? How do we then interrogate that space that these city has, these sites that replicate or kind of bring forward historical characters who are white, to ignoring or leaving empty the conversations and the impact of those who are Black, Indigenous, other racialized people. Sedina Fiati. Sedina has been a long ally, friend, provocateur, can go on forever, with CPAMO. And in her engagements recently has been involved in something called the Black Pledge, getting organizations across the country to make a commitment, not just to have a performative statement, but to make a concrete commitment about change that they're going to introduce so that Black bodies are represented in arts organization at all levels. Something we heard with Barry Hewson on Wednesday in his efforts at the National Ballet and his work with the Indigenous Association of Black Dance and so on. And then finally, some of the changes that are happening in funding with the Toronto Arts Council. We have Timaj Garad. Last year, the Toronto Arts Council opened up a specific program for Black artists. The question is, where is that going? How is it evolving? What resources are there? Are those resources enough? Do we have a really good understanding of Black arts engagement in the city of Toronto to have a sense of whether or not the program started is actually having an impact in bringing about change? That's the session we're going to have for the next little while. And we're going to start with Ian, who will be our first speaker. He will be followed by Marguerite, who will be followed by Khalidah, followed by Cheryl, Sedina, and Timaj. All the bio notes will be in the chat room. Ian, over to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Beautiful people. My name is Andre Espinet. I am a multidisciplinary artist, a graphic designer, as well as a 20-year veteran of the nightclub and concert scene. Most recently with the onset of COVID and the racial pandemic, I have pivoted into my life's work, which is focused on our community. When the Black Tuesday initiative took place last year, I noticed that our industry was very quick to come out in support of Black communities, despite their historical and storied history of exploitation of Black music, culture, and intellectual property. And consequently, I started an initiative called BDRB, Breaking Down Racial Barriers, with a partner, David Cox, who is a veteran of the music industry from the record label side. Basically, the initiative was started as a 10-part panel discussion on anti-Black racism in the music industry, and looked at areas ranging from economics to media, the impact of anti-Black racism on creatives, artists, and we also looked at things such as succession and retention, getting Black people into the industry, outreach that's necessary, et cetera, and things for the process of escalating Black people who are presently in the industry to another level in the C-suite or in the executive suite, where we have decision-making power and are able to control our own narratives. So basically over the last 10 weeks, over the 10 weeks between August and October, we had 60 Black working professionals who came in and spoke on everything from their experiences with microaggressions all the way to deeper issues, that we got into in the grant systems, in terms of the lack of understanding, the absence of outreach, et cetera, et cetera. And so what this resulted in ultimately has been an initiative which will take place on June 2nd, the 1-year anniversary of Blackout Tuesday, which is coming up in approximately 2 weeks. And we have basically been reaching out to the entire industry to come together and sign a declaration in support of ending anti-Black racism in their spaces. Now, the entertainment and music industry, or the music and entertainment industry, consists of live music, publishing, and the record labels, DSPs, digital service providers, artists, media, and all sorts of creatives who are involved in the process of creating and disseminating Black music and culture in our space. So basically, the declaration is a document which encourages companies, individuals, corporations, organizations in the space to begin where they are and work towards the goal of eliminating anti-Black racism in their spaces. So what we've asked them is to start with more manageable goals, because frankly, if we wrote the document the way that we wanted to, we would probably have a lot of pushback in terms of getting organizations and spaces to sign on. So we started by asking them to basically do ridiculously small things like acknowledgement of biases in their spaces, having uncomfortable conversations about race and identity, and all of these, conscious and unconscious bias and things that should be second nature, however, aren't. We asked them to educate themselves and the people around them on anti-Black racism. Start by reading articles and news stories and purchasing books and understanding white fragility. And again, things that are seemingly ridiculous to people who live these experiences every day, but are not so intrinsic to people as you move outside of Toronto. We ask them to do things like advocate, speak up when you hear racist statements, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's where we started on the document, and it goes through and it highlights the issues that myself as an event producer, but artists and all Black people working in the space experience. We're in a conundrum situation where there is a lack of race-based data. Canada's mosaic, we don't see race, politely racist space, has failed to collect data which is essential to determining the scope and intensity of the issues that we face in our market. And that has ironically been the thing that has come back around to be used to explain why we don't know what the scope or intensity of the issue in our space is. And so to this end, we have initiated via the report, which is ensuing from that document and from those roundtables and research, to request that organizations that sign the declaration engage in ongoing collection of race-based data toward diminishing the issues that they have in their spaces. These data would include data on self-identifying Black staff at all levels of the organizations, collection of key metrics pertaining to the number of Black employees, the percentage of Black employees, the number and percentage of Black employees in management at all levels, including senior management, the percentage of Black board members, and people straight across their pipeline. You know, we've asked them to actively and voluntarily participate in market studies and research initiatives that are supported or led by Black organizations, Black-led organizations, not Black servicing organizations necessarily. Conducting surveys of staff which audit and examine workplace demographics and company culture. Development of strategies and recommendations which respond to issues that are raised by these surveys, and the creation of development plans to implement recommendations from these spaces. You know what I mean? And so we are trying to, through these processes, gather a temperature check of what it is that is happening in these spaces in terms of the Black staff and employees that are working in these environments. Similarly, and we got a lot of pushback in the request for annual public disclosure of workplace diversity data, including, you know, things like pay ranges and staff makeups in their annual reports, corporate shareholder statements and websites. Tons of pushback, but these are the kind of information that are critical to figuring out what the issues are and moving forward. The document also speaks about representation throughout the music industry pipeline. We are not represented in the executive suites, which means that we are not determining our own narratives where it pertains to music. What types of music we put out, whether that music is violent or homophobic or sexist. We are living the narrative of people who believe that they understand the culture of Black music, but oftentimes understand the culture of, I don't know, street culture, or, you know, like I had someone say to me, you know, I understand Black culture from a radio station. I was there on the block with Mandem getting drawn down. And I was like, that's not Black culture. Have you ever been to Alvin Ailey? Have you ever read a Bell Hooks book? Like, that is not, it's this DJ Khaled esque, I understand Jamaican culture because I understand the stereotypes kind of issue that we're dealing with in the music space. And so, you know, the music industry, which benefits so substantially from the intellectual property of Black creatives and musicians, like if you look at the numbers across the board in terms of what is being sold, the top artists in the world are from Canada, and they are Black music artists, whether or not they are white artists like Justin Bieber. And so to these end, we are pushing these organizations and spaces into new hiring practices, into embracing things like open invitation, and making you know, open hiring, consideration of people who under normal circumstances would be excluded from traditional hiring processes, you know, by looking at work experience in lieu of certain other things. Because, you know, like for instance, I got into an argument with a professor on a panel a couple of months prior to COVID, where we were talking about the lack of respect for Black art forms and dance, for instance. And I was saying until our dance forms are revered with the same respect as ballet, for instance, breakdancing, or our art forms are respected with the same sort of reverence that Group of Seven is, that we have a problem. And she was like, well, you know, it's funny, Crazy Legs from the legendary Rocksteady crew doesn't have a master's, so he can't teach it at university. And my question to her was, then who is going to judge him when he goes through the process on the things that he created, right? So, you know, we are pushing these organizations to adopting things like cluster hiring, the process of hiring employees in groups rather than individually. In places like the record labels, we are asking them to consider the fact that Black people and the majority of the music forms that are in their organization are Black music forms. whether those be rock or EDM that has traditions in house music from Detroit and Chicago, whether that be jazz, which, as we all know, has been co-opted in the same way that, you know, Big Mama Thornton was co-opted by Elvis. Like, looking at that fact and not forcing us into boxes like Black music departments, when there are Black people who are proficient and practitioners in all music forms. Because as I said, most of those music forms are ours. So, you know, ideas like cluster hiring and open hiring, where special consideration is given and special outreach is given to correct historical wrongs. You know, a couple of months prior to, or as the racial pandemic started, I'm not sure where she's from, Jessie Reyes, a Universal artist, called out the record label on the disproportionate number of Black people working in the space. I believe she said there were 8 employees in just under 200. And very few of those had been there for years. And very few of those were in executive and decision-making positions. So we are asking them for voluntary submission of industry-related positions with in their organization. There has been a little bit of advancement, no pun intended, with the creation of Advance, which is a music collective for Black music industry individuals. And so we've asked them, for instance, to post any job postings of any sort to Advanced Music's employment boards. You know, updating their screening processes. Their HR departments across the board are outdated and lack the ability to hire diverse individuals. Their panels, their standardized conducting processes are outdated, and they're plagued with implicit bias. You know what I mean? So those are the kinds of things that we are asking for there. In terms of retention and succession, we have identified that there are specific issues with Black women, particularly, and we all know that Black women open doors everywhere they go. So it's ironic because Black women moving into executive spaces open doors for everyone. So we are looking for tracking of Black employee drop-off, using exit surveys for all staff to figure out, because we're having a brain drain in our industry. There's a glass ceiling that Black people who are working in the music industry hit, and consequently we leave. We get as far as we can, we beat our heads against the wall, and we leave and exit into other industries completely. Working towards developing work cultures which support professional development and career development for Black people. There are tons of mentorship programs for other people, and you know, by and large, these have been created in the diversity and equity committees and whatever these things are. But diversity and equity in our industry has primarily meant white women. You know what I mean? So we have talked to them. Sorry.
Ian, I just wanted to ask a question about
Yes.
with all of these provocations you're sending out, what responses, if any, are you getting?
I guess we are going to see in the near future. The report is the report that's forthcoming from the panel discussions is coming out in the coming weeks. The declaration will be signed and has been signed and ratified by over 60 organizations up to this moment. We're going all the way into June 2nd and beyond. It will be an ongoing initiative to try and get companies on board. However, as you know, none of these things are binding. It's very, very difficult to get organizations and archaic spaces to change processes, especially when the people that are at the top of these processes do not think that there's a problem, right? When you have diversity and inclusion seminars in companies and the executives don't come. You know what I mean? Like when you have lunch and learns in place of real work, you know what I mean? So it'll be interesting to see, but the reason for the declaration is to bring people to the table so that we can create some sort of accountability for these measurable outcomes that we're creating in the report.
It'd be interesting to see that because it's a spotty picture. Last year, obviously out of Black Tuesday, so many arts organizations put out solidarity statements, etc. And yet, we're a year later, as you say, and we're wondering what is the change. So, for example, we had Dory Tunstall, the Dean of Fashion, on a keynote on Wednesday. We talked about what you said, a cluster hire, both of Indigenous faculty and of Black faculty. No questions asked. There were going to be 6 Indigenous faculty hired, there were going to be 5 Black faculty hired.
Yep.
Then we also had Barry Houston on from the National Ballet, who spent 3 years working with the International Association of Black Dance, which is looking at having Black people inside ballet companies at all levels. But we don't know the outcome of that. We didn't say how many numbers, when it would be done, whereas OCAD-U was very clear, very specific, and very time sensitive. Any thoughts around that?
So, I mean, where cluster hiring is concerned, I think that my concern, and I've written this into the report, is that it's great to hire a bunch of new employees in groups to fix an issue in an organization. However, if the intrinsic issues that are in the organization are still cancerous, you know what I mean? Like if you're bringing in people and not fixing the issues behind them, and they're feeling isolated and leaving, then there's no difference. So it's like there's a bunch of work that needs to be done all simultaneously in different areas of competency training and like all of these things like anti-oppression training and et cetera throughout the organization, as opposed to just doing these things that sometimes, while while intentionally meaningful, like are potentially more harmful. And to your question about hiring, like what I've noticed in our industry, and I don't know how many will agree or disagree with me, is that there's been a lot of movement, but there hasn't been a lot of growth, right? And meaning that people are moving from position to position with the Black Tuesday squares, etc. People have received individuals who have been well deserving of advancement long before Blackout Tuesday, were fast-tracked into positions. But there's been a lot of movement around the industry and not a lot of new individuals coming into the industry. So that's one of the things I've noticed as well.
So you got 2 compliments in the chat room that I'll read out to you and move on to our next speaker, Marguerite. First one says, thanks for seeing our effort in your comment, Black women open doors everywhere they go. That's tweetable. The second one is opportunity for more inclusion, diversity, and equity in our industry has primarily meant white women, your quote. And the comment here is, many have shared this with the person who sent this. Thank you for courageously sharing this. Because it is that point, as we said earlier, we point out whiteness, we get so much concern about, oh my God, what are you talking about? Thank you, Ian.
Yes.
Move on to our next speaker. And wow, look forward to the report. Our next speaker, Marguerite Pigott, who is, as I mentioned earlier, and her bio is in the chat room. Marguerite, over to you.
Thanks so much, Charles. Thanks for having me today. It's a real privilege to be part of this conversation. I genuinely appreciate it. And let me start off by acknowledging Ian's point. I agree. It's true. It has principally been focused on white women so far. And I think acknowledging that is a good step for all of us to take. So I am a film commissioner and director of entertainment industries at the City of Toronto, as Charles said. Film and entertainment industries exists within economic development and culture at the city. My colleague, Cheryl Blackman, is acting general manager of economic development and culture. So she is going to speak to some overall characteristics of our division, like the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit and how we work with them. It's not, she'll discuss that, and the program advisory council as well. So she'll discuss, along with her own remit, some of those bigger issues. I'm going to really focus on the industries within my sector, which are film, music, tourism, and interactive digital media. So I will, because film and music seem to be more on point right now, I'm going to move through interactive digital media and tourism quite quickly. The interactive digital media unit is 8 weeks old. We're just in the process of starting the consultations for the strategic document that will be the 5-year strategy for that unit. We have already reached out to the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit to make sure they know we're going to be coming to them to consult with them in terms of the building of the strategy and so on. But that's a very, very nascent initiative. So not too much to say there, except watch this space. Tourism. So when it comes to COVID, tourism is one of the industries that is hardest hit. That whole unit has been sidelined right now. So I'm not going to speak very much to tourism today, and it's also not terrifically relevant for this group. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So in terms of how we relate to, I'll speak about film first, because it's a very particular way that we relate to film. We don't fund the creation of film. This isn't an office that supports creative opportunity. It's not cultural. The film office at the City of Toronto is very much industrial. So there's one part of the office that's film permitting that, you know, whenever you see big white trucks on the streets, that's us, that's our team making that happen. But also film sector development is a really important part of what we do. We do a lot of workforce development there that Charles is well versed in, because he did facilitate the sessions that we did with a lot of our community partners, like Oya and Black Women in Film and POV and Center for Young Black Professionals and so on. So I'm going to speak a little bit about what we're doing in film, and then I'll move on to music as well. So both film and music have strategic documents that highlight space availability of space and infrastructure, workforce development, promotion, and so on. We also, it's important to note, since COVID hit, we've done a lot of outreach and a lot of consultation with Black-only creators, with people of color, with Indigenous creators, with LGBTQ2S, with different industry segments, to find out how is it hitting them, what do they need, and try to get, you know, be more informed in the current circumstance. And of course, we heard a lot, but some of the overall themes were we need access to space. We need a voice at the table. We need access to opportunity. And so I'm going to go through some of the initiatives today that were in process before, but are definitely accelerating now. So with regard to film, just going to give you an overall bird's eye view of the industry in Toronto. The film industry is a $2.2 billion industry. The last year we were able to take full stats, and it employed 30,000 Torontonians. So it's a big industry. We've, in the last 3 years pre-COVID, we had 10% growth in the industry year over year for the last 3 years. So it's growing extremely quickly. And here's a really critical thing to note. The one thing that has been curtailing the growth of the production industry in Toronto has been available studio space. And because we've been putting some work in on that, studio space is projected to increase in the City of Toronto by 63% over the next 5 years, which is huge. So now workforce development is a very big issue for us. And so there's a lot that we're doing in this space. So one of the things we did is we commissioned a workforce development study where we indexed how much workforce we're going to need against how much the studio space is growing. So we were kind of trying to do a square footage per number of employees kind of formula. And we layered a skills gap analysis over that. And then in addition, we supported working with Quillen Consulting and POV and the United Way. We supported a study on systemic and other barriers to access to employment in the sector, so that these things could condition how we worked towards developing workforce development for this very significant need in the future. Now I'm at a bit of a disadvantage today because we were successful in landing a very large grant that's going to help us to expand our workforce development programs. And the granting body hasn't announced it yet. So there are things that I can't talk about that I wish I could, but I will try to give you a sense of where we're going. So we're expanding our programs enormously with a strong emphasis on inclusion and equity. And this is not just in response to the growing studio space, it's also in response to the fact that what we hear from Netflix, what we hear from Amazon, what we hear from Disney, from CBS, is that these are platforms that are telling stories to a global audience. It's one of the reasons why they want to be located in Toronto, because we're one of the most diverse cities in the world. So if the city doesn't take, if the industry doesn't manifest that strength in how we work every day, then we are not living up to our potential and not living up to what our clients want. So we're certainly really, really focused on that and see that as our growth going forward. So in terms of what the funding is going to allow us to do, we're going to be able to directly train and get right to the door of the union, which is a big deal because it gets you through the whole permitting process and gets you your hours on set and your training and all that. About 100 participants this year, over 100 participants this year, who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. For one of these programs that I unfortunately can't talk about in detail today, there are 4 cohorts. 3 of those cohorts are Black only. So I was really interested in the points that Ian Andre was making, and I'd love to talk more about that, because certainly the idea of working in a cluster is what was motivating that. And of course, these programs are designed not just by us. We do this in partnership. This one in particular with POV and with Center for Young Black Professionals and with the unions. So it's definitely community-led as well. And also the film office does fund community-led programming as well by organizations like Oya, Artworks TO, Remax, NIA, and so on. This year, we're also launching a Film Careers Toolkit, which is going to be an online tool that will help people to kind of figure out how they can get into the industry, demystify it. So if you decide I want to be a cinematographer, you'll be able to go to this site and say, and find out, this is how one becomes a cinematographer. These are all the possible routes. These are all the unions involved in those routes. These are all the training organizations and supports involved in you getting to this place. So that will be available online. Hopefully that will help people access the industry more readily. And of course, one of the things we do is we reach out through the TDSB to schools across Toronto to educate students on the opportunities that are here for them in the industry. So that's a really important way to access talent at a really young age. And we work with BIPOC Film TV and Access Real World through Real World to use their databases to make sure that the clients who are working with the film office are fully aware of and hiring BIPOC talent. And we work as a bridge to them to amplify that. So that's some of the work that we're doing on the film side right now. With regard to music, Ian Andre already mentioned the advanced program. I think the advanced program is really important. So Mayor John Tory, along with the Slate Family Foundation and Advance, Canada's Black Music Collective, announced I can't remember the date of the announcement, a $2 million program to address exactly the issue that Ian Andre was discussing, which is that in decision-making roles and executive roles in the music industry, Black people are underrepresented. And so a new executive director for that program has been hired, Kezia Myers. We have our first meeting with her next week to discuss, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, Kezia or Keziah, so excuse me for that. So we have our first meeting with her next week. So I don't know much about the program yet. It's yet to be specifically designed, but I do know that it will include mentorships and internships and incentives for advancement, master classes, and things like that. Additionally, the music office creates opportunities for performers, Toronto musicians to perform, whether it's through City Hall Live or 311 or City Hall Live Online or YYZ. And so we do have diversity stats on that program. And of the acts we programmed, 47% of them feature Black artists, which I'm sure will come as a surprise to none of you. So that's some of the work that we're doing on the music side. Now, the tourism side, as I mentioned, tourism has been sidelined because of COVID, but what they have turned to is the Show Love TO initiative, which is an initiative you haven't heard of yet, probably, but you will, because as the mayor puts it, it's what's going to happen when we're able to press the big green button and reopen the city. And it's a campaign that will go out across the city to reanimate the city, to get culture back out on the streets, to get street level businesses in neighborhoods across the city active and engaged again, to bring citizens out of their homes again. And there's work we're doing there with organizations like Black Foodie on some of the restaurant programs. We've done community grants to community organizations across the city who are partners of ours in doing this. And our approach is absolutely citywide. There are 140 formally recognized neighborhoods in the city of Toronto, and working with community organizations, we've programmed strolls in each one of those 140 neighborhoods that have 10 to 15 local points of interest, and walks and ways of engaging with the local community and celebrating that we've been working with community groups to develop. So that just gives you one angle on some of the work that we're doing through Show Love TO. So that gives you a brief overview of where we're at in film and music right now. And of course, working with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, and with our community partners who are guides and partners in everything we do.
Thank you, Marguerite. There was a question around how people can get involved in the consultation on the digital project that you're now beginning.
Right, so I would say email me. The consultation that we're doing, I would say email me, because I'd really love to know your organization. We're working with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism unit, and through them, I would hope to get some contacts in community that we could follow up with. But if you can approach me directly, even better. That would be great. I can put my email in the chat if that's helpful.
Just about to ask you to do that.
Okay.
Perfect.
I won't multitask because I can't do that and talk at the same time, but.
I think there's another one too around, good to hear the increasing numbers of Black artists, Black organizations involved in your area. And I guess the question is, is there a really good picture that you're getting at this point in time about Black activity in film and in music, like that might spell out, or do you still feel there are gaps that you're still searching for or trying to get to fill?
There's no question that there are still gaps. So we have to be extremely active on this, Charles, not just in the near term. This is a long-term undertaking, because the gaps and the insufficient representation is of such long standing. And it's caused by all the things that Ian was just talking about, the things that he's challenging in organizations. So in terms of gaps, I mean, I hope the programs that we're doing with community groups and with unions are helping to address this, but there's no question that a broader look needs to be taken at this, that includes everything from education. We've even been having conversations with TCHC about, if someone's living in a TCHC home and they get a job placement, what does that do to their ability to keep that home? There's certain rules that create barriers in all kinds of different ways. And we need to take, it's a long process, it's a detailed process, it's a rigorous process, and it has to be led by and done in partnership with community. So yes, there are still gaps, Charles.
Thank you, Marguerite. We're going to move on to our next speaker, and Marguerite will put her email in the chat room for those who wish to get in touch with her about any of the items she did speak about. Our next speaker is Khalidah Bello. Khalidah, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really an honor to be on this panel here with such significant, impactful leaders. I've been fortunate to actually attend Ian's fabulous events celebrating soul music, positive soul music, and community, and building that for everyone. He's legendary in our music scene and very accessible. I've also been fortunate to connect with Marguerite and found her to be so accessible as well. So her desire to have people connect with her is no surprise at all. I'm really impressed with the 60% growth in the number of studios that can be used for film. The Film Career Toolkit will be phenomenal to help people navigate the film industry. So sometimes you feel like you have the talent, you don't know how to get there. And I'm really, really excited about the master classes, mentorships, and internships that Advance will be bringing forward. So this is all very, very exciting news. So my name is Khalidah Bello, as Charles has said, and I lead Ogotawa, a nonprofit creative arts and culture organization that helps artists of African descent to share their creative talents with global audiences in ways that bring them greater financial security. And we are lucky to have a Joshua Glover the bust of him be created. It's in the making actually by Quentin Versetti, and it was commissioned by Artworks TO. So this is a real precedent-setting event. So I have a question for folks on the call. And I'm wondering how many of us have seen a full life-size statue of a Black Canadian leader outdoors in Toronto? You can answer audibly or put your notes in the chat.
I would suggest, yeah, there's a lot of I haven't, nope.
Okay, all right.
None.
Yes, and so the next question is, how many of us have seen a life-size statue of a Black Canadian leader anywhere in Canada that's been created by a Black person of Canadian descent?
Same.
Right,
No,
right. Yes. So these are things that we may not always think of, but they're quite important. We've been here in Canada since circa 1589, and there's an underrepresentation of the significance of Black people's contribution to Canadian society, past and present, and the permanent life-size public art monuments in the GTA. So the work that we're doing is calling on the courage of leaders in the GTA to help us confront this stark disparity in Toronto. Especially Marguerite mentioned that we're one of the most diverse cities in the world, if not the most diverse. Like I know even in comparison to London and New York, Toronto stands apart, and we have the largest Black population here. So this disparity is really troubling. Representation matters. So Black Canadian history for most in school systems focuses on the Underground Railroad, and we don't look at ourselves as Canadians in terms of the trauma that we brought to the Black community when we think about enslavement in Canada, which is kind of glossed over and not focused upon. We tend to focus on Canada as savior to Black people in the US. And when you compare the time that the Underground Railroad had actually ran in comparison to the enslavement of Blacks in Canada, the disparity is so vast. Like the Underground Railroad was approximately less than 30 years of an experience. And comparatively, there were about 200 years of enslavement of Blacks in Canada. So we're really not painting a truthful picture of our history. And besides Harriet Tubman and nowadays Viola Desmond, we talked about Marianne Shadd and the good work of Cheryl Blackman at Museum and Heritage Services, we have limited exposure all year round to historical contributions of Black Canadian leaders. Oftentimes, the leaders that we do recognize are phenomenal Black Americans that came to live in Canada for some time and left again for the USA, right? So Harriet Tubman is among one of those people. And so we seek to focus on tales of contributions by Canadians so we can learn how the Canadian Blacks who made Canada their permanent home were able to improve the country for everyone. And the stories abound. Canada Post documents them in a stamp series honoring the Black community. I'm wondering if anyone has seen those stamps. They often come up around Black History Month. And this is important, and we seek to create commemorations that have permanence. We have commemorative days, parks, streets, buildings named after some of our leaders like Lincoln Alexander and Harriet Tubman, and that's important. Yet there is something so powerful in being seen as we are in a figurative way. Portraits are powerful and enduring, and when they're in materials such as bronze or iron or marble, they last like a millennium. So from Mona Lisa to Michelangelo's David, we can see how this has an impact on the world globally. They inspire awe. So building streets and days named after leaders help us be recognized, and yet we may not engage with them with the same representational significance as we would art sculptures that would help us see and make real what someone that looks like us has done for our nation. It's harder to feel we resemble or we can resemble the individuals we cannot see on buildings, park names, streets, and square names and such. So we have a vision. It's part of the Black Entrepreneur Program, and that's taking artist and entrepreneur and making them into one word. And our vision is to make sure that Black Canadians feel recognized, cherished, and honored as valuable members of our society who've really been critical to Canada's success as a nation and have made an impactful influence on the country. And we also want to make sure that Black sculptor artists feel supported and empowered as the entrepreneurs they are with appropriate resources. Because right now, the medium of bronze to be able to create these lasting portraits, it's not accessible because it's really expensive to create sculptures in that medium. So our Black artists can't afford to use them. And the other thing that we're really wanting to do is to make sure we have an opportunity to improve Black people's lives nationwide using art to help alleviate racial trauma. We know that these sculptures can have an impact across the nation because, again, I'll go back to Michelangelo's David. How many of us have seen the images? I have never seen this in person, but I've seen the images through media and it's had its impact. So what we're seeking to do is to create life-size and visible tangible portraits that are designed by Black artist entrepreneurs, and they would celebrate the contributions that Black Canadians have made to advancing all of Canadian society. And we're seeking to create a garden of 20 to 25 statues across the GTA. And when folks hear that number, they're like, wow, 25 statues, that's a lot. Let's think about like 1589, folks. Like this is when we were here, right? If we had been making sculptures and documenting our presence, how many sculptures will we have? I then go and take a look at the now era, it's the Scotiabank Arena, and use it. This sculpture set that I want to talk about went up when it was the Air Canada Centre. And I don't know how many folks have seen these sculptures, but they are I think about 14 to 15 sculptures of hockey players celebrating 100 years of hockey. And it was created by a white American artist. Thankfully, we have 2 Indigenous hockey players that are represented, and there's no Black representation at all. And that 15 series of sculptures is all in one place, in front of this the building. And the last one went up in 2017. So this is not a long time ago, right? So we know that this work can help us combat systemic exclusion and discrimination that Black artist entrepreneurs experience in Canada's arts economy, because it will be able to be part of their portfolio, right? That they've created this works and it can help them get more commissions. And then we'll be able to raise the profile of Ontario as a province rich in cultural heritage from the Black community. We'll be able to increase the capacity of communities to conserve our heritage in Ontario and address anti-Black racism. Think about Black people being in conversation with the non-Black community when we're not even around, which is what I think is so powerful with the impact of the sculptures and the ability of them to influence and inspire young people. And it gives us an opportunity to cultivate the growth in creative industries that make Ontario a leader in the knowledge-based economy. So what's really exciting is that this project and program will actually be done in collaboration with continental African artists. So what we're trying to do is also, address the stereotypes and the unidirectional flow of information from the West to the East, or the global North or the global South, right? And also honor African intelligence and in terms of the generations in which people have been making these sculptures and artists have been making these sculptures that we're not able to access here yet in Canada. So we're going to get creative direction from a West African master sculptor who will be teaching the Black artist sculptors, the emerging ones, about how to create these in bronze and the significance and meaning and permanence and the value of this work. And I know Marguerite talked about tourism being kind of on pause, but what we look forward to is that this will help national tourism, domestic tourism, international tourism. And we're also inspired by the example of South Africa in terms of the South African Sculpture Park. Get this, they have 100 statues in their sculpture park commemorating people like Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo, and they're planning to create another 200 more. This is in Cape Town. So I want to just wrap up with this quote by Kehinde Wiley that really inspires me. And he's such a celebrated African-American artist. And he says, "I went in reflection to the statues or sculptures that he sees that, you know, are kind of that cause trauma to the experience of Indigenous or BIPOC community." This is what he expresses. "I'm a Black man walking those streets. I'm looking up at those things, monuments of leaders that oppress Blacks, that give me a sense of dread and fear. What does that feel like physically to walk a public space and to have your state, your country, your nation say, this is what we stand by? No, we want more and we demand more." And then Sandy Hudson, who's co-founder of Black Lives Matter Canada, has said, "Why are the statues of slaveholders and genocide actors more important than our own lives?" And she's reflecting on the trauma that's experienced. The work that we do is really guided by this quote that was found at the Legacy Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. And it says, "For the hanged and beaten, for the shot, drowned, and burned, for the tortured, tormented, and terrorized, for those abandoned by the rule of law, we will remember with hope, because hopelessness is the enemy of justice, with courage, because peace requires bravery, with persistence, because justice is a constant struggle, and with faith, because we shall overcome." And so what we're calling on folks in the community to do in terms of leaders and influencers is just to help us accelerate this process. We've been fortunate to make great progress with an institution, an educational institution in our Toronto area that is really excited about moving forward on the sculpture project. So you will be hearing more about that in the future. It was 10 months in the making, and we're really excited about that unfolding further. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you, Khalidah. Very inspiring. And what's resonating with me is a sense of bronze. And so I think of the Benin bronzes, which are always abstracted as sort of being this anomaly that somehow came out of this continent where there was no intelligence and that kind of thing, and yet they're all around the world. And what a historical rebound, so to speak, to have these statues made in bronze, if that's what the material is. And I think of, these individuals, people like Chloe Cooley, for example, or we already heard Marianne Shad Carey, the stories around Black Ice, Black people's contributions to hockey, which Hamlin Grange captured in his documentary called Black Ice. Viola Desmond, and so on. We talk about Canada being a spot where we cherish human rights and so on, and don't associate Marianne Shad Carey Shad with that, nor Viola Desmond, which is really quite surprising because that's what they were pushing for. Viola 6 years before Rosa Parks, and Marianne Carey Shad, obviously, 1840s, 50s, etc., and so on. Can you talk a bit about these presences and how the process will, assuming successful, how will you choose which so many historical figures to commemorate?
Wow, it is really a challenge for sure. And what we definitely, thank you so much for all that you brought up, Charles, is quite important and very, very relevant to the discussion. We know that this cannot happen without community consultation. Like, it is definitely something that we need to gather together as a community to decide upon, so that we can all feel included in the process of just remembering the great heroes of the past, and doing so in a way that will further inspire our future. And I'm really just enthused about the opportunity to be guided by the wisdom and intelligence that CPAMO has generated over the past number of years. And we're really going to be leaning very heavily on CPAMO for giving us guidance with regards to their excellence in community consultation.
Happy to lend support. And there's a wonderful offer here that I'm seeing in the chat room that reads, "So excited to hear about this project. Craft Ontario may be able to help with accessibility to bronze sculpting studios in and around the GTA. I think this is something they would be very happy to collaborate on if that is desired, hopeful." And with CPAMO, we are actually working with Craft Ontario in one of our change projects, so we can certainly relay that message. And also the comment is given by somebody who's with Craft Canada.
Fabulous. That would be phenomenal. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalidah. Wonderful, and let's keep this going. Let's, fingers crossed, this happens because it's needed. As you say, 1589, we're 400 years after. Our next speaker is going to be Cheryl Blackman, the city of Toronto. Cheryl, where are you?
Hi, Charles, and good afternoon to the entire CPAMO Gatherings family. Thank you for having me here. I'm really, really honored to be here. And Khalidah, you know, I really appreciate what you said in your remarks about just, you know, needing to overcome, and absolutely that is our objective. And certainly in my role as acting general manager for economic development and culture, and in my base position role as director of museums and heritage services, I see myself in the museum's role as the chief disruption officer. You know, so we were talking earlier about bureaucracy and the bureaucratic kind of lens. And I think what you'll find with myself, Marguerite, and my colleagues at the Toronto Public Service is that we really are moving forward with this idea that we have to innovate to create different futures. The future that we saw pre-COVID is not the future that we are going to be able to or want to be in post-COVID. So, you know, we are certainly moving forward. And as proud CDO, I'm really grateful to be here this afternoon, and I'm going to share my screen in a moment. But I just want to give you a little bit of background about economic development and culture through this perspective of museums. You know, in the Toronto History Museums, we have been going through this transformative change. And this change began, quite frankly, in advance of COVID. We started looking at who we are, the fact that we are very unknown, that we have 10 historic sites that are assets to and should be assets for all Torontonians, and that we should be leaning into this idea that we want to be able to tell stories that reflect the past, the present, and the future. And we want to move from this notion that, you know, future should be dystopian. We want to make sure that we fight against those kinds of challenges, and that we are actually lifting up and elevating voices that have not been heard. So when you hear me talk about awakenings, think about it through that lens. And before I kind of switch over to my PowerPoint, I just want to call out and shout out my co-provocateur, Umberine Inayet. Umberine she's the wind beneath my wings in this awakenings journey. And I am so grateful for her partnership and her collaboration and her ability to touch the hearts and minds of Torontonians and artists and creatives everywhere. So I cannot go forward without acknowledging her straight up as a boss, okay? I'm gonna share my screen. Hopefully it's gonna work, because, you know, these things never work when you want them to do. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it, but it's there we go.
How are we doing? We good there?
We're good.
Perfect. Economic development and culture, we are working very deeply on not only an awakening of our programming, but just an awakening of how we approach all of the work that we do in the division. And so we are partnered with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, and we are really moving forward on this idea that, you know, over the next number of years, we want to prioritize and center a change in our culture. We want to be able to build capacity for communities. We want to work through this idea of finding and developing safety and well-being, and creating alternatives for the things that challenge our communities the most. And we want, more importantly than anything, to be able to develop this idea of Black resilience and Black prosperity. So in terms of the Economic Development and Culture Division, I just wanted to give folks a chance to get a sense of who we are. We are a division that spans across business growth service on the business side. We've heard from Marguerite Pigott earlier, our film commissioner, and with her lens on entertainment industries. Pat Tobin, who many of you will know from Arts and Culture Services, and of course, Joanne Pinn, who's covering for me while I'm in the interim general manager role. And we're supported by Sophia Arvanitis in our transformation office. With economic development and culture, what we're focusing on over the next number of years is this idea that there are 4 key areas of importance to us: inclusion and equity, talent and innovation, space and access, which is so important to so many cultural creatives, and operational excellence. And we're doing all of this in the spirit that we need to see Toronto thrive and business thrive through the lenses of culture and the lenses of small business and large business as well, because we want to see economic prosperity for everybody. So in recognition of this work, we are leaning in very, very heavily to this idea of an equity plan. And equity is our spine. It is going to be the backbone of all of the work that we need to do in order to create real change in the city of Toronto. Over the past year and a half, we've been working pre-COVID on this idea of having a strategic goal that really is about planning around equity. So our equity plan that is now in place wants us to kind of contemplate, what does it mean to increase diversity in our workplace? What does it mean to increase diversity in advisory boards and the vendor relationships that we have? How do we build and foster a divisional culture that's committed to equity? How do we take all the spaces that exist within the city of Toronto and share those spaces in a way that actually creates common good and common growth for community partners? How do we play a leadership role in promoting equity? How do we reach out and engage and prioritize communities that are underserved and underrepresented? And how do we ensure that there's continuous improvement in measurement? And Ian Andre spoke about improvement in progress through measurement. And this is something that we're deeply kind of moving ourselves forward on. We've also now created a Economic Development and Culture Program Advisory Committee. That committee just launched. And in fact, Dr. Dory Tunstall is our chair of that committee. It's a committee that will have both business and cultural leaders sitting at the table with economic development and culture staff to help to respond to and support the needs that are coming from the Black community. So the leadership at this table is 100% Black. And that's something that we're really, really excited about, to have that kind of focus in the work that we're doing. We've also created a BIPOC programming advisory committee group for museums specifically. And that group has a representation of over 80% of the members who are Black as well, to make sure that we are thinking about and fostering this idea that as we've tried to tell the untold story, that story is being told through the voice of community, not through the voice of the quote unquote authority, because there's nobody who's an authority of anybody's story. These stories belong 100% to the communities that are represented, and we need to make space for that to happen. In terms of the sites that are represented in the museum's collection, many folks don't realize that the City of Toronto owns and operates Sedina Museum, which is now a National Historic Site on the top left-hand side of the screen, Colburn Lodge, which is located at Hyde Park, Mackenzie House, you heard about at the beginning of the presentation, Montgomery's Inn at Dundas and Islington in the west end of the city, Scarborough Museum in the east end of the city, Gibson House in the north end of the city, Fort York National Historic Site, which is actually one of the original historic sites in our suite of properties, the Market Gallery at St. Lawrence Market, Todd Morton Mills off of the Don Valley, and the Zion Schoolhouse. And these spaces ultimately will only have value if they're shared with Torontonians and made available as spaces where people can tell stories that are not the stories of the usual suspects. So Awakenings comes to life for us during a pandemic. You know, we were talking about a new vision of this view on the past, the present, and the future. But when we're in a situation where we have a challenging time, where we have these limitations on how close we can be to one another, we needed to find the stories that helped us to build connections and to ultimately have us feeling that the voices of Torontonians could be included and could actually lead the way. So Awakenings is really a programming philosophy that helps us to lean into this idea that, you know, Black, Indigenous, and people of color can be and should be the storytellers of their own journey. And so we've reached out and we've created a great opportunity with the support of community to be able to tell stories that are anti-oppressive, anti-colonial, and anti-racist at the heart of what we're trying to do. And of course, none of this is ever possible without a village. We've been able to create the Awakenings Task Force, and we're so blessed to have amazing cultural leaders like Wayne Mangesha from Soul Pepper Theatre, Dr. Mark Campbell, Canada's only hip hop historian, Dr. Julie Nagum, Roger Mood King, who you will all know from all of his amazing food programs across the networks, Natasha Henry from the Ontario Black History Society, Ashley Mackenzie Barnes, and Julian Christian Lutz, PKA Director X, who are members of our task force and who are really bringing voice and representation in ways that you could not imagine. So over the course of this first period of time over the winter, we launched Awakenings. We launched Awakenings during a pandemic. And many people would say, how could we do this during a pandemic? But part of our mantra is no more excuses. Anybody who's worked in the cultural sector, whether it be galleries, libraries, archives, or museums, we've all heard all the reasons why we can't. And we wanted to put that on its ear. And this is also a Quentin Vercetti image of Joshua Glover, hopefully when we see the monument in the future. And we really do believe there's a lifetime of stories that need to be told, and we need to make space and share space for those stories to be told. So in the winter, we kicked off our campaign, and we worked very closely with Director X and 10 emerging filmmakers. And one of the things that's so exciting about Awakenings and the fact that it happened during a pandemic is that we ended up hiring 200 people to get involved in the Awakenings movement. And 80% of those 200 people were Black people. And this is exactly the focal point. This is the objective for us all. The idea is to bring light to truth, to stories, to name the presence that we all know we've had, to confront the erasure that we know exists, and to do it not through our voices, but to make room for historical narratives to be shared and honored by the communities whose stories really rest and vest in the storyteller. We are so incredibly honored to have Cardinal Official create an original song for the Awakenings movement in Freedom Heights. Cardinal just recently became the Senior Vice President of A&R at Universal Music Canada, and he did this work for us after hearing about the story of Joshua Glover. The story of Joshua Glover inspired him so much that he reached out to Julie Black, to Susan Carroll, to Emmanuel, to these beautiful, amazing artists to be able to create this opportunity for us to share the story of Joshua Glover. And the most kind of encouraging piece of this whole thing is that when you download the song, the proceeds of the song go to help NIA Center for the Arts build their cultural center. So if you haven't downloaded the song, if you haven't had an opportunity to share the song, please do share it in your networks this weekend, because NIA Cultural Center is trying to build, and they have real tangible goals they're trying to reach. And we all need to be part of helping and supporting them to make that happen. And then, of course, we worked with Roger Muking, and I just have such a love and respect for Roger Muking. Roger Muking has a deep passion for stories around mental health, mental well-being. He bridges the gap between advocacy, cultural leadership, and culinary programming to be able to bring real talk programming to anybody who wants to listen to it. So we created a series called Behind the Curtain. And we also did some amazing work with him that really confronts the challenge of what is happening within the Black community as we confront COVID-19. So, moving forward, we understand that working with, Julie Black, Cardinal Official, with Roger Muking, with all of these amazing artists, that we were building a movement. We're creating our own kind of anthem. And so the Toronto Raptors have come on board to be part of that storytelling journey, because confronting anti-Black racism is a city priority, but it really needs to be a global priority. So we are reaching out to as many people as we can find in the community who can help us to advance the dialogue around confronting anti-Black racism. There needs to be nothing but pride felt by any organization when we stand up and confront anti-Black racism, shoulder to shoulder, locking our arms and actually making real change happen. So I mentioned earlier that Roger Muking was doing some really pivotal work with us. And most recently, he sat down with Dr. Eileen Davila and created a series around COVID-19 called Real Talk. And this is something that Roger is so proud of, and we are so proud of, because he got together with Dr. Roberta Timothy, Stachin Frederick, Dr. Suzanne Schusch, and Dr. Davila, and spoke about the impacts of COVID-19 and this challenge and the fear that we feel in our communities to get the vaccine, but to do this in a very real way. And this is not the kind of work you expect a municipal museum to be doing, or any museum to be doing. And that's exactly why we're doing this work, because for myself and my colleagues, it's about centering, the realities of what affects Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. It's about those conversations about trauma and inequity, and the realities that there's a disproportionate impact, both with transmission, around wellness, around prosperity, around the emotional tax that's being paid by Black community. And we just need to be very clear that we're comfortable putting that out for everybody to confront, but more importantly, for us to change. Working with Wayne Mangesha, Debbie Young, Anita Africa, and AC Mensa, we've also now moved forward with an artist mentorship. And this is something we're so excited about, because the first group of 10 in the cohort with Director X, that was our pilot to see, could we pull this off during a pandemic? And again, using that no excuses kind of framework, we now know this is something that we must and will continue to do. And back in July of 2020, we in EDC announced a $1.2 million reallocation of funding to support Black cultural creatives and the work in the community. And so part of this mentorship commitment, and it's not just because of COVID, it is ongoing and it needs to be sustained. So we had an open call that was launched on February the 4th, and the program actually went live on April the 21st. And we have an amazing array of young, mid-career, extraordinary people who are going to be moving forward in this mentorship and working in our theater space, because many people don't know that Todd Morton Mills, one of our theaters, is a 160-seat theater, as well as a nature preserve, as well as a gallery. And so having that space available to ourselves, we want to cultivate performance and dance and really shift this idea of interdisciplinary practice using the assets that we have available, and more importantly, sharing those assets with community. So we are really excited by the prospect that there are 10 young people who are going to continue to move forward at our 10 historic sites and work in partnership with Soul Pepper Theater Company. Over the summer, we are all living this COVID reality right now. And so we know that virtual programming is the place to be for the time being. This is AC Mensa right at the front of A Revolution of Love. And hopefully, if you haven't seen the Revolution of Love video on YouTube or our toronto.ca/museum site, you'll go and check it out. But over the summer, we are planning to have a ton more virtual programming that really supports this very bold understanding of the fact that we are proud of being Black. We are proud to support Black community. And we are more than ever proud to be able to make space for stories of Black community to be told through these 10 historic sites. Through the fall, we are all really hopeful that we'll be able to be vaccinated and begin to, unveil some on-site programming that really shows and demonstrates to all of Toronto what Awakenings and the philosophy of Awakenings is truly about. So please, please, please stay tuned for that opportunity. We expect it to be coming to a museum near you through 2020 in the latter part of the year, as long as our public health guidance allows us to do this. The other part of our work is working in partnership and collaborating, and Marguerite spoke about that, and all of the speakers today have spoken about that. We are working on a BIPOC fellowship, and you may have already heard that Karen Carter, who's a co-founder of BAND, and Gail Lord, the president of Lord Cultural Resources, they envisioned a future which is a future that we envision as well at the Toronto History Museums and the City of Toronto. A history that has to be broken, this idea that, Black folks cannot be, Indigenous people cannot be, and people of color cannot be in leadership. This history, this legacy needs to be dismantled. And so we're very, very focused on working as partners in the museums, galleries, libraries, and archives sector to begin to combat the reality that these spaces are incredibly white. And there is not a lot of movement that we've seen in leadership in these spaces over the last 25 years. So we are working in partnership with Karen Carter and Gail Lord to be part of this pilot fellowship program that will include the Royal Ontario Museum, the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Toronto Public Libraries, the Toronto History Museums, the Power Plant, and the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina. And this fellowship will launch in autumn 2021. So we're thrilled to be partnering in this and to be supported by Jeffrey Latimer and the supports that are going to come out of the Monet exhibit that are going to go live later this year. So I really welcome and invite everyone on this call to check out toronto.ca/museums. Join us on the hashtag awakenings, hashtag tell the full story, and really be part of this journey with us, because when we already know from some of our early evaluation that when we do this work, 80% of the folks who came and saw the work so far, they indicated in recent evaluation that this programming increased their understanding of how history has really not been about telling the full story. So we are very purposeful. We are very thankful to be working with, Quentin Versetti, who recently won for his Mission Sankofa film that he did through the Awakenings, a film festival award. We are honored to be in this company, and we certainly want to be moving forward and really conveying this reality that anti-Black racism means telling the full story. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. That's a lot of information. So we'll have to make those slides available to people. If you have a chance, if you can drop them in the chat room, that would be great. I'm going to go to our next speaker, because I think she might be talking around similar things in terms of positions of Black folks in arts organizations. And then we'll take some questions or comments from the two of you after that. And then we're wrapping up with Timaj, the Toronto Arts Council. So Sedina Fiati. Sedina, over to you.
Thanks, Charles. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here, for inviting me to be here. It is my absolute pleasure. I've been involved with CPAMO since the beginning, and the evolution has been tremendous and has certainly contributed to my activism and art practice. So just to launch right in, the Black Pledge, just to talk about how this all started. So just to introduce myself just a tiny bit, and I know my bio will be in the PDF and in the chat, but I am mainly a theater and film artist and activist. I was formerly the co-chair of Actor Toronto's Diversity Committee, and I've also been on Canadian Actors Equities Council, and I'm a mover and a shaker, and I ask hard questions. I'm continuing to be a consultant and just, a lady about town. So the Black Pledge, basically to explain what it is exactly what it sounds like it is. It's a pledge that a group of us who mainly work in live performance have created to get organizations on board to really walk their talk, as Charles talked about, to really make a solid and long-term commitment to not even just the inclusion, but I would say the support and the affirmation of Black artists and Black art within their institutions. So how we started was, I had to put this in, but a few years ago, Rachel Matumbo, who was a recent grad of National Theatre School, wrote an article in Intermission, basically just really calling out how difficult it was to be a Black performer training in that space. And I remember we read that. I met that with my friend Megan Swaby, another wonderful artist, and we were just like, let's convene a bunch of Black women and support her and other recent grads who were experiencing racism within the institution. So that was 2017. And then skip ahead a couple of years, Alicia Richardson created what she called the Wind Down, which was a monthly play reading group, which was specifically just for Black women who work in theater and film, and for us to come together monthly. When the pandemic hit, we started to meet quite a lot more often than that via Zoom. We read plays, we talked, we we did the things. And so I personally was sitting with a lot of feelings when May hit, and when, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and just the overall uprising. And even as an activist, I just realized there was a lot of baggage I had. And so I just was like, I want to see some tangible change. I'm tired of seeing, the generations below me go through same institutionalized anti-Black racism. I'm really tired of it. I'm tired of the things that I experienced. So I emailed the Wind Down list and said, hey, everybody, I wrote this email and I'm just going to read it. Dear Black women in live performance, first, let me express how much I respect and live for Black women and how much I respect all of you. We've all been through so much between the combination of misogyny and anti-Black racism, overall disrespect for those who are queer, disabled, poor, have mental health issues and learning challenges. We can just add that to the mix. How are we still here? I'm nervous to email you all. I've been working on a pledge document that is a call in for the live performance industry. I would like this document to go to PACT, the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres, and as many theatres across the country as possible. I want to acknowledge that this pledge is pretty mild. If it needs to be stronger, let me know. I also want to acknowledge that so many of you are working on your own projects, have built your own platforms outside of the white mainstream, and are frankly slaying the game. I'm doing the same, maybe not slaying. This work exists along these efforts. If you want to join me in a working group to work on the pledge, just let me know and we'll start another thread. If you want to comment on it, I welcome that too. Access is closed for editing, but let me know if you want that access. Part of the plan for this pledge will include a media release so that it gains some traction and creates the pressure we need. Much love to you all during this difficult time. I'm about the call-ins right now. So I wrote that, and several people identified themselves who wanted to work on it with me, including Joella Crichton, Diane Roberts, Jujube Mandela, Shamaka Glory, Khadija Roberts, Abdullah, Leah Doze, and Rita Deverell, and others who I'm probably forgetting, but those are sort of the main folks. So we started to meet on a regular basis. One of the first things we did actually was that I pitched this as the Black Pledge as a topic for the PACT Con. So I was like, because they were open for workshops, so I was like, I'd love to present what we're doing with the Black Pledge and get feedback on it. So that was one of the first things we did. We presented at PACT Con a version of the pledge. This was last August. Joella and I did that and really, really asked people who are representative of predominantly white institutions, some really key questions about how they were engaging with Black people. So from there, we kind of took a little break, but then we started to meet again pretty much on a weekly basis to go through the pledge and really go through a really rigorous editing process that included a lot of consultation with the community. So not just ourselves, but we reached out to other people, including people who we consider elders like Philip Aiken and Audrey Zuna Mandela and Diane Roberts and others and Rita Deverell, who's also part of our collective. And we reached out to all kinds of artists saying, do you have things to say about this? And we incorporated their feedback. And we just really went through and really thought about what it is we wanted to say and what it is we wanted to happen. So we released the pledge in late February. And since then, we've met with several theater organizations, government representatives, the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. We've met with PACT, the Professional Association of Canadian Theatres. We've also met with TAPA, which is the Toronto Arts Performing Alliance. And we have two organizations that are very close to signing, which include Canadian Stage in Stratford, and we're in talks with Nightwood, Necessary Angel, Shakespeare in the Rough. We have upcoming meetings with Buddies in Bad Times, New World Theatre, 2B Theatre, and Ghostlight Theatre. What we want to continue to do is we want to continue having these meetings with organizations in order to get them to commit to signing the pledge. And we want to have roundtables with PACT and with TAPA. Some of the feedback that we've received has been a lot, but I think that it's best represented for people to talk to us, to see our faces, and for them to develop a relationship with us. So we're really looking forward to working with those ASOs to really get that off the ground. What we're really moving toward is eventually the creation of a Black artist service organization. We really want there to be a space for Black artists to be able to have their needs met. There's a question, but I'll finish this thought and then I'll address the question. We also want to have a mutual aid fund, which will provide mental health supports for Black artists. A key question that's been coming up for us is just like all of the work that is happening, and I'm so interested in the voices of Black artists. We have a lot of the voices of Black arts leaders, but a lot of us on the ground, we need to be heard, and we need our needs to be met too, in addition to all of the wonderful initiatives that are happening. Just to outline some key points of the pledge, and then we'll get to some questions, because I'm sure those of you who haven't read it are wondering what it's all about. The pledge, by the way, if you want to go to our website, we have a website. It's theblackpledge.ca. And you can go to that website and see all about us, who we are, what we do. But I'll just outline a few key points about the pledge, and then we'll get to some questions. Okay, so basically the pledge asks theater, dance, and opera organizations to make a 3-year commitment to the following: creating and updating policy and addressing past harms in regards to Black artists and Black practitioners, increasing Black representation beyond tokenization, prioritizing historically marginalized groups within Black communities, make an annual monetary commitment to the collective, which will cover operating costs, as well as the establishment of an arts service organization and mutual aid funds that will support mental health services, professional development, and entrepreneurial aid for Black artists and arts workers, to work at building and repairing community relationships with Black people. So those are what we call mandatory commitments. We also have a series of other commitments that are capacity-based that address programming, hiring and casting, Black community support and reciprocity, and training and development. So the capacity-based commitments they're kind of optional, but they're really based on, because especially thinking of theater specifically, which is the lens we're coming at this with, and we hope to expand in the future to really address dance and opera and various other disciplines. But for now, theater is where we're at, because that's who we are. There's so many different sized organizations and different ways that organizations work across the country. So these capacity-based commitments, we expect that a large organization like, say, a Stratford in the world should probably do most of them, and a smaller organization that maybe only has like 1 full-time staff member, if that, or maybe it's just the collective that works on a per project basis, they're probably going to have the capacity to do fewer of these things. So that's it. I will take some questions now, because I talk too much, and so I'm keeping together.
No, you did not. There's a question here. What challenges are you seeing, and what positives are you seeing?
Oh, great question. So, Charles, you say that, and then I remember there was once a CPAMO I spoke for like 20 minutes, and I remember that, and I'm just like, okay, girl, like, rein it in, keep it in. So, yes, just to answer that question, some wonderful things have been coming to light, and one of the main things that we're seeing is that a lot of organizations, as we all can identify, are actually doing a lot of the work around anti-racism and anti-oppression. We're interested in how the Black Pledge can bring people together to talk about the work that they're doing and remove the silos around this work. As well, like, I'm also feeling a way about the fact that, like, this work just seems so underground somehow, you know? It's just like, okay, we're meeting with consultants and then we present this fabulous plan. I'm so interested in the process of how you got to that plan, you know? So that's one thing that we've been really a wonderful, like, opportunity that we're seeing for the Black Pledge. Some of the challenges have been, yes, certainly there's organizations that have expressed that they don't want to sign the pledge, or they don't think it's right for them. We find, my feeling is about that, about organizations who come forth with that immediately, you know. I think they're just not, I feel like deeply what we feel and what we're trying to put forth with the Black Pledge is relationship. And so to be in dialogue with us as Black people, as Black artists, which hasn't really happened. Like, sure, they hire us for things, you know what I mean? But they don't, like, do they actually talk to us? Do they know what we need? Do you know, like, we want to create those relationships. And so for people who aren't coming from a community-minded organizations that haven't made that shift to a more community-minded mindset, they don't really understand what it is that we're trying to do. So much of what some people have also said that, like, the pledge, these things, yeah, sort of just to say that the pledges and things like that and commitments can seem empty, right? Like, they're just like, is this a public relations exercise? Is this an exercise to make you feel better? Are you actually going to do the work? So certainly there's been backlash even from the Black community, being like, are they actually going to make the changes? But for us, what was important for this was that, yes, they make the changes and that they be in dialogue with us on a regular basis about what they're doing and how they're going about that. So this isn't necessarily like you sign the pledge and that's it. We think of the pledge as a process for you to go through, pretty much. But that's what it is, because really I feel personally that process and relationship and listening, as basic as those things sound, is actually what is going to make the change. We got here from a white supremacist framework that doesn't value those things, that values product over process, that values capital, that values work, that values all kinds of things that actually I feel like we need to shift away from and shift towards something that actually allows us all to be in contact with each other and allows us to create an environment where both art thrives and the people who are making the art thrive, the people who are supporting the art thrive, and ultimately the community thrives, you know?
Thank you. There's a common kind of question, and Cheryl could chime in on this. There was a question for you, Cheryl, about the Black Fellowships, and can you expand on that, how people become part of it? And also to you, Sedina, there's a question here about, will you consider expanding this to areas where new artists often start, which is really in community theaters, small independent theaters?
Sure, I'll go first.
I'll go first and then Cheryl. Yeah.
Then Cheryl, great. Okay. Sure. Yes, definitely. I mean, the only thing that keeps us from expanding this pledge at the moment is just our own capacity as a small collective. So, I mean, my vision is, and I dream big, is that, you know, we should touch various aspects, and those, I would love to see groups of people creating their own pledges or their own pledge processes to address the different niches that they work within. Because I think we were best poised to do this one because we all worked extensively in theater and know it well and know the things we've experienced and don't want to anymore. So yeah, I encourage you, if folks know of other Black folks who want to get involved, please be in touch. I will put our email address in the chat, and we will follow up because we're always looking for new members.
Thank you. And Cheryl, can you talk a bit more about the fellowship?
Yeah, thanks for that, Charles. In terms of the fellowship, we are working on the program right now, the program design. So there is in fact a team that is working in partnership on the framework for the fellowship. So that's still in progress. We will have more information coming over the next number of weeks, probably in the early part of the summer. So we will link back with CPAMO, make sure that everyone knows about what the involvement entails.
Thank you. And not seeing any more, I want to get, because we have one other important initiative with the Toronto Arts Council. Timaj, where are you at? There you go, on to you.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here alongside so many amazing panelists. So thank you for that. My name is Timaj Garad. I am new at TAC. I'm the Outreach and Access Program Manager at the Toronto Arts Council, TAC for short, for those of you who may not be familiar. So I'm also a practicing artist and organizer, spoken word artist, singer-songwriter, and the focus of my community work outside of TAC so far has been really focused on building capacity for Black artists with a specific attention paid to, you know, Black women and Black Muslim in the arts scene in Toronto. So that's a little bit about me. And my role at TAC is actually to lead the development of a new Black arts funding program and to also manage this program once it's up and running. So that's what I'm going to be focusing my talk on today. I also support outreach and accessibility across our organization within our various different programs that we have going on at TAC. So for those of you who don't know, TAC is the arm's length funder of the city, supporting artist collectives and organizations with art practice through various different funding initiatives, through discipline-specific and strategic funding programs. So this program is being proposed as part of our sort of annual recurring funding at TAC. So the Black Arts Funding Program has been proposed to address the current disparity in access to arts funding for the Black community in Toronto. It should be mentioned that we do gather data to assess our impact as a funder. And in looking at that data, funding success rates at TAC for Black artists in categories of individual arts funding and project funding didn't actually differ significantly from the general population. So that means that Black artists are getting funded in these categories. However, that doesn't mean that barriers don't exist to funding, and there are still areas and that the data doesn't capture that are nuanced. So we're continuing to look at how we're capturing data and to look at areas that are currently not targeted. And barriers to funding, of course, still exist for the Black arts community, and TAC recognizes the need for a commitment to greater outreach and to greater engagement of the Black arts community to challenge systemic barriers, and not just looking at funding, but to looking at how are we creating supports that are sustainable for Black artists. The keyword being sustainable, because we also acknowledge that there's a need not only for targeted funding, but to also structure that funding in ways that support artists and Black-led arts organizations, Black-led, Black-focused, and Black-serving, in a holistic way by including additional supports. So that's looking at things like, greater access to stakeholders like venues, collaborators, mentors. So we're looking at building resources and supports and community partnerships within this funding structure, so that the funding is actually being structured to respond to those needs. So we know it's important to consider accessibility as well within our application process. That's something that we've been having a lot of conversations with applicants around. And we also want to make it known that we do have existing supports available to applicants that unfortunately seem to sort of be kind of tucked away or hidden, or a lot of people just don't know about them. But in addition to that, we want to look at structuring our application questions in a way that really simplifies the process and removes barriers, so that people are not feeling like they have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get the funding. Looking at also providing sort of pre-application support. Myself as a program manager, part of my role is actually to support, to include part of that mentorship role in the relationship I have with applicants. And that's the same with all program managers at TAC. However, this is not something that I think people know. It's not something that we've historically been very transparent about. So part of what we are trying to do is also to really make sure that that advocacy piece is known, and make sure that the supports that are available are known as well. So there needs to be a little bit more transparency. There needs to be more of that repair and trust building with communities, including various communities, but especially the Black arts community. So we do have an equity framework in place that prioritizes equity seeking applicants, including Black applicants, and they're assessed by a panel of peers that represent the demographic of the applicant pool. And although this has been an effective inclusion practice, we also need to respond in a dedicated way to the specific needs of the Black arts community. So last year, we actually created an anti-Black racism analysis tool for the Toronto Arts Council and Toronto Arts Foundation. And this was based on the city's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit's Anti-Black Racism Analysis. So this tool that we developed is a complement to our equity framework, and it contains a series of questions based on Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit's analysis to really help us to consider and ask ourselves those important questions, to consider the experience and expertise of Black artists and arts workers, and our decision making at all levels of TAC. So to give you an example, one of the principles that was identified in that analysis is relationship building. So we would need to then ask ourselves, whenever we're creating a funding program or looking at a funding program, how does this granting program build relationships between Black artists and organizations? And as TAC or Toronto Arts Foundation, building those relationships in ways that are intentional, meaningful, and reciprocal. We're also looking at asking ourselves questions like, are you regularly attending arts events by Black grant recipients? Are you regularly inviting Black artists onto awards and grant review panels? And then moving towards that to discussing and looking at the development of this new funding program, we really wanted to create a program that sort of challenge the traditional program development structures, which are, top-down, Eurocentric, not really looking at creating with community. So this program is really looking at community, being very heavily involved in the process. So we engaged in a community consultation process in the design of this program, and we're continuing those processes. So before designing the program, we wanted to consult with Black artists and arts workers about their experiences. So we did that last year. And this was really to understand the needs and priorities that we should be focusing on prior to sort of creating what the program will look like. So we wanted this funding program to be community driven and community informed. So last summer, we sent out a survey and held a number of consultations over Zoom, sort of like focus group style consultations. And this was led by external consultants, Paulina O'Keefe-Anthony and Kai Nirma Pitanta, who are Black arts workers and artists themselves. And they created this process to really start those conversations with community. What came out of this was a report summarizing recommendations. And I want to actually share some of the things that really stood out from these conversations that we had with Black artists and arts workers. One of the things that came out of this was the need to build bridges with the Black arts community and funders. So there was a lot of skepticism, a lot of this need to sort of build trust, a need to have greater transparency with community to build that trust. We also discussed things like making sure that when we're calling for applicants, that we're not just looking at work that speaks specifically to the Black experience, but amplifying any work on any subject matter from Black artists who might apply. Also focusing on things like professional development, mentorship, and networking were things that really stood out in terms of areas where Black artists need some more support. And marketing support, just amplifying the work, disseminating the work. We also discussed things like creating accessible application processes, the inclusion of Black artists in this whole program development process and throughout the process in a continued and meaningful way. Community-specific accessibility measures were also examined and implemented towards the grant design and the structure of the application process. So all these conversations and consultations really informed the program's initial design, which I'll be sharing with you shortly. And the program direction was determined based on these sort of internal assessments that TAC did of current funding gaps within the Black arts community, but also on these priority areas that I just mentioned that were identified by the Black artists and arts workers that were consulted last year. And there were about 179 people that were involved in that consultation process. So continuing community consultations was really essential because we really wanted to make sure that those voices are heard and continued to inform the development of this program. And we see this program as a living program where community have a say from the beginning through consultation process, but also throughout. So as the program is happening, we really want to make sure that we're looking at collecting evaluation data to make sure that we're continuing to understand how this program is impacting community and making sure that we stay agile and attentive to the needs of community as the program is kind of out in the world. So the program scope and the design we're proposing is 2 general program streams. So an annual operating stream for arts organizations that are Black-led, Black-focused, and Black-serving. And project grants that would support arts creation in any discipline, as well as professional development and presentation of artwork, of existing work. So each stream will have what's called a rolling deadline, which basically means that applicants can apply throughout the year. And the program would be a fixture, again, as I mentioned earlier, and recur annually. So in addition to these changes, we will be making a commitment and have been making a commitment to actively work towards greater access to funding for Black artists across TAC programs, and not just specifically for this program, but by improving outreach across the board, which was also identified as an area of improvement for us. And particularly, we want to improve access and outreach in programs that support things like sector innovation, leadership development, and looking at also some of our historically underfunded areas of our discipline-specific grants. Because although overall applicant success rates at TAC for the project grants are on par with the general population, as I mentioned earlier, that's not actually evenly distributed across all of our programs. And there are some programs that still require some more intensified outreach and access to Black artists. So it's really important to note that successful applicant rates are not the whole story. We are also asking, what happens once the funding project is complete? How does that support create space for that artist's work to be amplified and for them to flourish in their career? How has operating funding to Black-led arts organizations contributed to those organizations flourishing? And what supports and resources could we potentially provide in a holistic manner along with funding to support capacity building? Because the challenge really is in supporting capacity building so that the Black arts community can thrive long-term and not just for the duration of the funding. And that's more of where we're looking at that systemic lens, which we're hoping to approach this program with. So I want to share what's been happening. I know I'm running a little over time, so I apologize, but I want to briefly share what's been happening with the program since our first community consultations last year. So in keeping with the spirit of having this be a community-driven program, we recently shared our initial program design with the Black arts community through consultations and a survey, again, to engage in what we're calling a community co-design process with Black artists and arts workers. So we had about 123 Black artists and arts workers participate in a survey and give their feedback on the design, as well as 38 participants who were in a focus group conversations, a number of different conversations about the design. And we're currently just gathering and taking a deeper look at some of the recommendations that came out of that process, which will then inform the finalized design, as well as the program guidelines and the application and assessment process for this granting program. This is an opportunity to kind of think outside of what we've done traditionally to respond in meaningful ways to the needs of community, and to really look at some of the systemic changes that can happen in this program, but also reverberate in other programs across TAC. And we've been having those conversations internally with our team. So we hope to follow up and host a town hall prior to the launch of the program about the program. And we're launching the program hopefully later this summer. We're kind of earmarking July for a launch date, and we'll keep you posted on how this program develops. In the meantime, you can keep in touch with me or get in touch with me about the program. I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and that's pretty much it, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
I think as an artist, I'm going to say, wow, and share it with the other councils because they really need it. They need to hear this. They need to hear the specificity. They need to hear working outside the box. They need to hear looking at directly diversity within the African diaspora. They need to hear about the various ways in which we portray our art, which is not homogenous at all, and also its vibrancy. So it's good to see an arts council take that lead, and congratulations on that. I guess the key question around the implications of this program for the other funding streams that the Toronto Arts Council has in dance, theater, literature, etc. So would a Black artist, Black arts organization be able to tap into both, go for a dance project while maybe getting operating from the specific program for Black artists?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's something that we actually explored recently in our consultations, and we're still kind of determining the guidelines around what that would look like. But we are looking at, not having restrictions for Black artists who might be applying to this program to also apply to our other programs. So some of you may know how that some of our programs do have those types of restrictions, but we're looking at kind of reducing those restrictions for this program so that Black artists can potentially apply to a number of different programs at TAC and still access this funding. So it's not a barrier to accessing other types of funding.
So the question then, I guess, is what is the overall pool of funds, and then the size of, let's say, an operating average size, guest size of an average of an operating grant or a project grant?
So 500,000 has been allocated as a minimum for this program, and we're still again determining what that would look like. I think part of it would be how many people apply, and to determine how to distribute that funding, because with a rolling deadline, it's a little bit different because we're assessing things in batches throughout the year as needed. So we're still sort of determining that, but in general, it's 500,000 being allocated.
That's amazing.
Yes, for the whole program. Sorry, I just saw a comment in the chat.
Yeah, it's five, no, for the whole program. Yeah, Khalidah, sorry. Yeah. Wonderful. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat room right now, and we wanted to move to breakouts from about now to about 3:20. First, I really want to thank our panelists, Ian, Marguerite, Khalidah, Cheryl, Sedina, and Timaj. Really insightful. And the wonderful thing is, listening to all these various approaches coming from community, coming from the Arts Council, coming from city government, moving in the same direction, maybe not in the same path, but certainly heading in the same way. That's the kind of collaboration that we're excited about with CPAMO and want to see more of. And you can be sure we're planning another gathering, Divergence, for the end of the year, which is really going to be talking about art in a time of healing, the role of IDPOC arts in planetary renewal. So we want to invite you folks back because this stuff is contributing toward that. And is really quite essential. We have to keep our eye on this, as I say, keep the eye on the prize, because we know that the minute we take our eye off the prize disappears. Even when we keep our eye on it, sometimes it disappears. So let's just do that, and you can rest assured that CPAMO will be inviting you folks back.